I put out a tweet saying, hey, if you make anything, I'll play with it if you want to send me one. And I almost had to backpedal on that because so many of them don't support multisig. It's like, what's the point? There's so many ways in which a hardware wallet could be compromised. And it's so impossible to prove that it's not, that there's just no situation in which I would ever recommend a single key signature setup.
Hello, welcome to episode 70 of the Bitcoin Game. I'm Rob Mitchell. One of the great things about creating Bitcoin content is having people like Michael Flaxman explain directly to me how Bitcoin works. In this episode, we dig deep into Bitcoin security and multisig in what I think is a great compliment to Michael's appearance on the Stephan Livera podcast. I think you'll enjoy this. Hi Michael, how are you?
Oh shoot, I can hear your headphones. Let me try the headset. There we go. How's that sound?
That sounds better. Thanks for coming on. I thought you sounded really technically knowledgeable and really good at explaining on Stephan Livera's podcast. So I definitely suggest anyone listening to this podcast give that podcast a listen. I find talking about security and private key management and all this stuff just fascinating. It seems like it's such a tricky problem trying to be secure enough for the bad guys, but not so secure you can't access your Bitcoin. So I love talking about this stuff.
Cool. Well, thank you for having me on board. I like to joke with security that security and theft are two sides of the same coin. So if you were to throw away your private key in a secure way that it was definitely deleted, then no one could ever steal your coins, but you wouldn't have them either. And if you were to publish your private key on the internet, then you would never lose your coins, but somebody would surely steal them. And so the optimal balance lies somewhere in the middle where you and only you can access your private keys. And that's a really hard thing to accomplish in practice.
I was really curious. Are you interested in telling your Bitcoin origin story?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know that my story is unique or interesting. I heard about it in the middle of 2013, and I thought it was like another PayPal. And I was like, why does the world need another PayPal? This isn't interesting at all. And I kind of wrote it off. And it wasn't until around October of 2013 that I took another look at it and was like, whoa, this is way cooler than just another PayPal. I completely misunderstood what this was. And then I just sort of fell down a rabbit hole and never came out, which I think is the effect Bitcoin has on people.
Do you remember literally exactly what you were listening to or watching or whatever where you heard about Bitcoin?
I think I heard about it on TechCrunch and Hacker News were the two places where it was popping up a little bit. But it wasn't, there wasn't some magical moment. The white paper actually didn't really do it for me. Everybody loves the white paper and says that it was this moment of inspiration. And I think the white paper is great, but it didn't have that effect on me.
You had said your background, you'd started companies, and obviously you're a technical person. Can you say a little bit more about that background?
Sure. So I've built 3 venture-funded companies. One of them far more successful than the other 2. So that's what I tend to be known for. But I consider myself an entrepreneur, and I'm most comfortable with entrepreneurs. I think they're very weird people that I identify with very much. And I also like building stuff. So I remember I had this idea that in retrospect is a terrible idea, but in 2013 I was fascinated by this idea that Bitcoin just solves, which was there were capital controls in Argentina at that time. And there was a way people were getting around it where they weren't moving the money, they were trading IOUs. So what this would look like is imagine you're a person who's an American living in Argentina, and you're trying to bring some of your US dollars to Argentina to spend. Maybe you want to pay your rent. And then imagine you're an Argentinian who is trying to send some money to another country, like the US, and you're trying to get some money out of the country. And both of you have a capital control problem. One of you is trying to get money in, one of you is trying to get money out. Say that person who's trying to get money out has a child in college in the US and wants to send them money. It's very hard for the money to move across the border. But those 2 people could privately agree, hey, why don't I give you some pesos here in Argentina, and you'll wire some dollars between your bank account and mine in the US. And so the capital never moves across the country, but people are effectively able to convert their dollars to pesos or vice versa. And there were these Facebook groups for doing this, which I just thought was fascinating, where people would post saying I have this many dollars and I want pesos, or I have this many pesos and I want dollars. And because there was a community of people that did this regularly, they kind of like Skyped each other and said, okay, you seem trustworthy and we have these mutual friends on Facebook, and they would send money this way. And I thought like, oh, somebody should make a product around this. And I even like had started to build a little prototype of like trading credits and reputation of moving money around, which is such a dumb idea. But it was the idea of like some formalized way of trading IOUs. And then I discovered Bitcoin and I realized like, oh, this actually does solve a real problem.
And do I remember right that you actually were building something in 2013 for Bitcoin?
Yeah, in 2013, I was building this other thing, and then I discovered Bitcoin. And I wasn't like, this other thing was just like a project that I put 2 weeks into that I thought was really cool, and I started to have an MVP, and I was going to start showing it to people. But this is like one of these things where if you're a software engineer and you got a bad idea, you just like go run with it and build something for a couple weeks. This wasn't, like I never raised money or formed a company or even ended up launching the product. But I discovered Bitcoin and I realized that this is just like better in every way. That this is a real solution, not some sort of like hacky bolt on to the existing framework. And I started getting really deep into the rabbit hole of like, what is owning Bitcoin and what does it mean to own a private key and how do you hold Bitcoin? And so I ended up starting a company with a friend of mine who was previously a software engineer at Google, and we were going to do cold storage as a service, very similar to like what Zappo does, although they recently sold it to Coinbase, so soon to be Coinbase's business. And our big like differentiating pitch was that on Mt. Gox, you didn't have a Bitcoin address. So you were just sending money to a hot wallet and hoping that they were whole. And that scored of the same model as like Coinbase had at the time. And we wanted to give you an on the blockchain address that you could deposit funds to. In retrospect, also a terrible idea. You should store your own Bitcoin. But at the time, the options were like there were no hardware wallets and you had to have all this advanced knowledge to store your own Bitcoin private keys. Or you could just trust somebody that this company would be whole and you could deposit your funds with them. And that was fairly terrifying because people were depositing to Mt. Gox up until the day they declared bankruptcy. So imagine that the day before then, you sent them like 500 Bitcoin thinking that they were just fine. There had been rumors about them being in trouble for years. It was always FUD. Everything was allegedly fine. A lot of smart people lost money in Mt. Gox. And so that was like an insane setup. And it's still not that different with most exchanges. Like typically, they don't give you your own address on the blockchain where you can see that you're solvent at all times and know that every other customer has this guarantee. The basic thing is like, well, trust us. We've raised a lot of money and we know what we're doing. And that's not that different of a guarantee than Mt. Gox is, although Mt. Gox had some really peculiar things, like only Mark Karpeles had access to the servers and could push code. And they didn't use version control. He like manually merged everything in himself. So they were like extra incompetent, but the model wasn't different of just like, trust us, we'll hold your Bitcoin. What could go wrong?
So, and I feel like for years, people, I don't think I hear it discussed anymore, but that there were ways to prove how much Bitcoin was being held on an exchange and that could somehow be verified. But I don't know. Do you remember that?
Yeah, so you can, if you're willing to disclose your balances, if the exchange is willing to disclose how much Bitcoin they're holding, it would be fairly easy for them to prove, like, here's all of our assets, and we can show that we cryptographically own this, and then customers could go to some sort of site and prove that they were included in that. And that's all like fairly straightforward, no moon math or anything too fancy, and that's been available for a really long time. And to my knowledge, nobody really does it. But there's two huge problems with it. One, each exchange has to say, hey, this is how much Bitcoin we're holding. And they typically don't want to do that. Also, those sums are staggering. So, I've regularly heard rumors that Coinbase has like $5 billion worth of coin under management, which if you're Coinbase, you don't want to go like raising your hands being like, hey, everybody, we have $5 billion. That makes you a really scary target. And then the second issue about it that's arguably even worse is that you can look at the assets because those are, Bitcoin or altcoin tokens where it's fairly like provable that these things exist just by signing a message saying like, hey, I have these UTXOs and backing that up with your private key. or not backing it up, but demonstrating it with your private key. But the real problem is you can't show the liabilities. So like maybe you borrowed a bunch of Bitcoin to be able to make that claim or satisfy that claim, but you secretly owe a ton of Bitcoin or dollars or some other asset. So we can't say that you're solvent because we can only see your assets. We can't see your liabilities on a blockchain.
Gotcha. Well, yeah, those both seem like real issues. And for some reason, I thought maybe there was, I don't know if it's moon math, but some way to somehow verify without actually divulging how much that, but, some tricky way. But does that sound possible? I don't know how it would
maybe
work.
maybe there's something that someone's come up, but it's the liabilities problem that I can show I have all this Bitcoin, but I can't show if I owe people more than this Bitcoin.
Sure.
Maybe I borrowed this Bitcoin. Maybe I'm holding this Bitcoin. And in practice, it's somewhat antithetical to the spirit of Bitcoin anyway. I mean, not your key is not your Bitcoin. So you might need to leave some coins on an exchange. Perhaps you're a trader and you need to have it available to take advantage of trading opportunities or something like that. And so you would want an exchange that was better about trying to demonstrate solvency. But it doesn't really feel like anyone's trying.
No.
and probably because they know their customer. Their customer does not care.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's been most shocking to me to see this story play out just over and over and over again is that someone tells me, hey, I bought some coins last week on, insert exchange name here. And I was really nervous about the whole security thing, but it says on there that my coins are now mine in my account. So I think it's safe to leave it there, right?
Yeah.
And they don't understand that.
I had that exact Twitter interaction with somebody. I think like James Lopp or someone said, not your keys, not your Bitcoin. And someone's like, well, come on, people say that, but I have it on Coinbase. It says it's mine and they say it's insured. And like they really, that was their belief. But yeah, people really, new people really have no idea.
And they think that because they took this risk where for some number of days or a week, there was a counterparty risk that the money left their account in a wire and then the Bitcoin showed up days or a week later. And because they took that risk and it worked, that this company is now safe. But what they don't recognize is that if you leave your coins on that exchange for 5 years, you've taken a 3 or 7 day counterparty risk and turned it into a 5-year one, and totally by choice. And also during that period, you had incredible chargeback protections. Because if you went to your bank and said like, hey, these guys didn't deliver, I bought this virtual currency and they didn't give it to me, the bank more times than not is going to side with the consumer. So you weren't really taking that much of a risk in that period of time. But then fast forward 5 years later, if they lose your coins, you can't undo a wire from 5 years ago. That's just done.
Yeah, so the interesting part, and I don't know how many people are like this, was after a few people responded to this guy, including myself. He was like, "Okay, I just ordered a Trezor on Amazon," and I was like, "Who did you order it from? Was it third parties?" Like, "Yeah, some random thing," and I was like, "No, take your time. You gotta slow down, But yeah, so I guess we'll get into some of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think of holding Bitcoin as like operating a gun. It's not something that you just like buy one and show up and then start pushing buttons and see what happens. It requires education and training and understanding, and it is an incredibly powerful tool. The fact that you could walk across a border with $1 billion in your head is unbelievable, but you should probably practice and know what you're doing and learn about it if you were going to do something like that.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
Most people aren't accustomed to that mindset because if you mess up in your online banking, you can just go in and say like, hey, can you reset my password? And if money goes missing, you can probably show up to the bank and say, hey, can you fix this? This money went missing, and they can probably do that. And so it's amazing the disparity in security when I think of like my brokerage account and how easy it is to gain access to that relatively, but that's kind of okay because what can somebody do who logs into my brokerage account? They could sell some stocks and trigger a capital gain, and it would be really annoying for me. And I don't want anyone to do that, but it's not the same as stealing my money. And so they're probably not incentivized to do it either.
I guess I've always assumed they would all pump a penny stock or something. They would sell everything and buy a penny stock and then sell on their end. That's in my head what someone would do if they, I don't know.
That's the exploit that I think would be genius, is that somebody could get a bunch of bank login credentials or brokerage login credentials, and then at the exact same time buy or sell a penny stock, and be on the other side of that trade in their personal account. But they would look at the trading history and they would say, well, who bought or sold right before this massive movement? And then you would quickly triangulate who it was, because the person who was on the other side of that trade had an account with their name and social security tied to it. I think this was even in a Bond film where somebody tried to, they traded on information before like a bomb was going to blow up and tank the market, and you could see who did it. And then that's how they, like, one of the ways they were able to triangulate the villain. I forget which Bond that was. So it's possible, but it's a totally different security model than like, if I get this thing, I just steal your life savings.
So one of the things you said you did was you programmed your own wallet. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So I think building your own wallet is just a great exercise, because you have to understand the trade-offs. And I don't think you can really understand how Bitcoin works until you build all the pieces. It's easy to talk about it conceptually, but when you look at it and you're like, well, why does this work here? And what would happen if I do it differently? And so it came, again, there weren't good hardware wallets in 2013. And I wanted to really understand, like, what is the thing that I'm securing that is my Bitcoin? And I just used an open source library called PiCoin by Richard Kiss. That was at the time one of the better options out there, and started reading through the code and understanding, okay, this part's the private key. This is what I guard. The address is this representation of a public key. This is what I give out. I want to keep the private key totally offline, and I want to put the public key on my computer. And then you start to realize things like, oh, well, I need multiple public keys, and because I want a new address for every transaction. And then how do I back that up, and how do I store it, and how do I encrypt it? And you start going down this rabbit hole of security, which is a really, really hard thing. You find yourself playing around with different operating systems. Which encryption software are you going to use? Like, you might use OpenSSL, or you might use GPG, or you might use something that's pre-installed with your operating system. And at each step, there's trade-offs and questions. And it's a cool way to learn when you have a problem you're solving.
I bet.
It's much more fun than if it's just academic.
So if you were to look at that wallet today, do you feel good about it?
Oh, it's so bad.
Oh.
No, and I still keep a lot of Bitcoin in there.
So it's bad, but I guess you feel at least it's secure as far as the randomness to generate your private key and everything, or?
Yeah, that part I took care of when I was doing it. The bigger thing is how you devise your backups and recovery. So I split my... So I generated a bunch of private keys. This was before HD wallets. And then I put those on, and I did that on an air-gapped computer that was running the Tails operating system, which is one that wipes itself on shutdown. So it's designed not to use the file system. And it does all these fancy things. So like it wipes the RAM when you shut down to prevent a cold boot attack. It's like super paranoid operating system. And I generated all these private keys, put them, encrypted that, and put it on a USB drive, and then made a ton of copies of that encrypted USB drive, and I put it in a bunch of safe deposit boxes.
Mm-hmm. And what do you use to encrypt your data on your hard drive? I mean, on your thumb drive.
I used OpenSSL, okay. Which this was 2013. There's better tools available now, and Multisig is just better than everything I'm describing, by the way, which wasn't a super viable option at the time. So you should just use Multisig. But what I did is I took that password that was very long and randomly generated, and I split it with Shamir's secret sharing scheme. And I split that into 11 parts and handed them out to people that I trust. And a quorum of those people are required to combine to get the password to the USB drive. So the USB drives live in safe deposit boxes. You know, if one of my bankers is listening to this and thinking they want to drill my safe deposit box, they can. But not only are they risking their job and their livelihood, but they wouldn't have the password to decrypt those USB drives. And then there's all kinds of extra levels of redundancy, like there's different USB drives by different manufacturers in each of the safe deposit boxes, and they're all identical. So you only need one of them. It's just redundancy in case of failures. But again, now we have mnemonics, which are better. So you should use a mnemonic, which you can just put on a crypto steal, and you don't have to worry about like whether the crypto steal is going to fail in 5 years.
All right.
So,
but with encryption, I guess, or passphrase or something.
Well, that's one where there's a trade-off. Multisig really changes the game here because if you have like a 3 of 5 multisig, you might be willing to not have a password. You might want a passphrase, you might not want a passphrase. If someone has to break into 3 secure locations that are perhaps not disclosed, that might be good enough for your model. You might say, I also want a passphrase, but once you have passphrases, you need to have some recovery mechanism for if you forget them or get hit by a bus.
So the crypto steal is just one of several signatures necessary.
Yeah, if you're doing a multisig, that's one of the things that's very cool about multisig is you could potentially get a higher level of security with less effort. So that's the ultimate trade-off. Is like assume you had a 3 of 5 multisig, then you might say that for your use case, it was acceptable to have all of those 5 seeds be passwordless, meaning that if an attacker found 3 of them, they would get your Bitcoin. But it should be like in your safe deposit box, buried under a mountain somewhere, in your family member's safe deposit box. I mean, these are not easy locations to just show up and grab. And maybe you have a safe in your ranch or something where you have a lot of guns. So if you had that dynamic, you might say, hey, passwords make this more complicated. I'm not going to remember a long randomly generated password in 5 years. So it's actually safer for me to distribute all these parts this way. You might say, I definitely want a password, that I don't want to leave this thing laying around where people could find all the parts. And that sort of depends on what you're optimizing for. But generally, people optimize much more for these like theoretical James Bond type attacks, and then just forget their password and lock themselves out.
Sure. Well, then I feel like you got to back up your password somewhere in case something happens to you, just for that reason. So it's kind of a similar thing where you have multiple pieces you got to keep somewhere.
I mean, I see all the time where people keep a seed phrase on their hardware wallet, and they write it down on a sticky note with the hardware wallet and the password.
Yeah.
And so it's like, why have a password if it's written on the device?
Right, sure. And I bet you people back up their passphrase and their seed phrase in the same place. I mean, keeping the same safe or something too.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, what is the easiest way to utilize multisig for a non-technical person?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's still kind of hard. And that was one of the biggest pieces of negative feedback I got on my Stephan Livera podcast was people saying like, hey, I really want this. How do I do it? And so I'm working on a guide, a free guide showing some of the tools you can use to do it. The best option right now is to use Electrum. And I'm not a giant fan of Electrum. It has some negatives. By default, it sends all of your address queries to random third-party servers that are probably run by Chainalysis. So the default setting on Electrum is really bad for your privacy. But you can run it with something like Electrum Personal Server, where you run your own full node, you validate the consensus rules, and you fetch all of the balance and transaction history information from your own server. And if you do that, then it doesn't leak any private information, and you get these benefits of Electrum, which is it has a nice UI. And so I've set this up now many times where you have multi-hardware wallet, multi-sig on Electrum, and it's pretty straightforward to use. Like you see a list of your coins and your transaction history and your balance, and you can do coin control, and you go to generate a transaction and you can preview it on the screen, and it's all like very straightforward as you would imagine it works. And then you hit the sign button and it pops up on your hardware wallet saying like, hey, did you really want to send 1 Bitcoin to address A? And on your hardware wallet, you click yes, and then it pops up on your next hardware wallet. And it says, hey, do you really want to send 1 Bitcoin to address A? And you say yes. And maybe it's 2 of 3, so that's enough signatures right there. And then it would say, okay, this is signed. Like, do you want to broadcast? And you hit the button. And all of that is like pretty easy.
How about the setup of the whole system?
It's it's intermediate.
Intermediate
is what I would say. You don't have to be able to use the command line, but you kind of have to understand what's going on, that there are all these pieces, that you set your own threshold. I think 2 of 3 is the overwhelming right default for most people. There are people who would want to use something different, but 2 of 3 should be like, if you don't have an opinion, go with 2 of 3. And so you have to understand that like there's these three things, and any two of them gets all of my Bitcoin, which I think most people can wrap their head around that. And those things are seeds. So you have these three seeds. You could write them on a piece of paper and laminate it. You could do a crypto steel or something like that, which is great. Titanium has an even higher melting point. So if you want to splurge a little extra money to write it on or etch it on titanium, that's even better. But it's a mental model that I think people get. And the idea is to make the software so easy that all you're doing is just making sure two hardware wallets say the same thing. And what's cool about it is you create this system where you can make one catastrophic mistake and not lose Bitcoin. You might even be able to make more than one catastrophic mistake. So if you forgot the passphrase to one of your seeds and you kept that seed in a safe deposit box that emptied your box out and destroyed it, which very infrequently happens, or maybe a rogue banker drilled it or something like that, and you lost the hardware wallet that went with it, well, it's all one seed. So those three mistakes just count as one mistake. So you could potentially make lots of mistakes, but at a minimum, you can make one very bad mistake. If one of your hardware wallets was completely compromised, say because you bought a fake one off Amazon, or if the software that was installed on your computer was complete malware, or insert your bad scenario here, with a multisig setup that's designed around redundancy, you can have one of those things just go catastrophically wrong, and that's okay. And you can set that threshold. So if you have like a 3 of 5, you can have two things go horribly wrong, and that's okay. But if you get over that threshold, then you're going to lose coins. Okay. And that is a massive improvement, because currently, if you do a single key signature, you have to get everything right. One mistake can cost you all of your Bitcoin. And that's so, so terrifying, because there's so many little things that are very unlikely to happen, but possible. And there's an incentive for them to happen because an attacker might be able to exploit it. And the average user doesn't have the technical savvy to know better, because it's really hard even for advanced users. So the multisig thing is amazingly additive security. And if you do an M of n where you have, say like 2 of 3 or some number that's greater than 1 and allows for redundancy, you can kind of go a lot quicker and be a lot more careless because you have this security that is so much greater to begin with. Obviously, I'm not encouraging people to be careless, but if you did a careless job of a 2 of 3, you would probably have much more security than if you were super cautious and did a 1 of 1.
Okay, and on Stephan's podcast, you really emphasized perhaps using one hardware wallet that has its secure element, and maybe but it's closed source, and then others maybe open source without the secure element. Was that right?
Well, what I was saying, you'd ideally like the best practices in every category for your hardware wallet. But what I was saying was that if you had one good hardware wallet and then you added a bad hardware wallet to it, you would have a net improvement in your security, because it's unlikely it would be exploitable in the same way. So if there was some vulnerability in your good hardware wallet discovered, which even the best ones have bad vulnerabilities discovered all the time, the odds that someone was able to exploit that simultaneously with the bug in your bad hardware wallet are very, very low. So I, for example, personally, I would like everything that I use to be 100% open source. But if I had, say, 2 very well done, nice open source hardware wallets, and then I had one that was like closed source and might be malware and I can't trust the thing at all, I'd still rather use those 3 together than I would rather than use either one of the good ones, which is kind of counterintuitive, but I get this massive additive security. So I would prefer everything be open source. But if I can't have that, because like right now, for example, we don't have that many hardware wallets that do multisig and that interoperate with other hardware wallets. If I have to choose between lousy options, I'd still much rather have that. And that's a weird, like, counterintuitive thing. But about maybe explaining secure elements a little bit to people who don't know what the trade-offs there are. The really cool thing about a secure element is it can prevent you or give you a defense against this thing called an evil maid attack. So an evil maid attack is kind of a James Bondy thing as well. But the idea is that you have this maid who's been bought off by your adversary, and the maid, while you're out, has access to your hardware wallet. Maybe they're able to drill your safe or break in somehow, or they know that where it's hidden. and they get access to it, but they're stopped by your hardware wallet because it has some sort of a secure element, which means that even though they have physical access and they can plug into it and run some sort of, have some sort of device that's designed to interact with your hardware wallet, if there's a secure element, there's no way to extract the seed. And assuming it's implemented correctly, there's no way to extract your seed. And so that's a really nice added benefit, that you can know that like no one was able to plug something in and just brute force guess your password or PIN. The secure element would say like you only get so many tries before the thing wipes itself. So you can know that nobody else has like tampered with or tried to access your hardware wallet while you were gone. That is a very nice to have feature. The negative of it is that it requires some sort of PIN. And so now you have one more thing to remember, and the UI is one more step of complexity, which for your use case may be very well worth it. That is a nice extra feature to have, but I wouldn't say like don't use a hardware wallet that doesn't have a secure element. I would say use 2 or 3 or 4 hardware wallets, and some of them could have secure elements, some of them could not, and that would be better security. And they're probably going to be written in different languages and distributed by different manufacturers and have different supply channels or supply chains, and be vulnerable to different sidechain attacks. So it's one case where you're just better off to have more than you are to optimize all day long about whether you want the one with the secure element or not.
Gotcha. Right. And I'd love to drill down a little bit on the Electrum setup that would enable easiest,
but say intermediate level.
So you do have 3 hardware wallets, and I assume you'd have the 3 seed phrases backed up somewhere. How would you suggest where would they keep their seed phrases? I mean, not literally exactly where, but what would be a safe way to do that? And then are we talking with some encryption on the hardware wallet? Could you go through like all those details, what you think would make sense?
Yeah. So one of the things that's really, really good about multisig that I don't know that I mentioned previously is how good it is from an estate planning perspective. So one of the questions that I always ask Bitcoiners when they say they have a secure Bitcoin setup is, what happens if you get hit by a bus? And most people don't have a good answer to that question, which if you have a family is really sad because you probably want them to have your Bitcoin. And if you have a single key, that's a really difficult thing to do because like if you're just going to give a copy of your seed to your family, do they understand what Bitcoin is? Are they good at securing private key material? That's a real vulnerability. But with something like multisig, you could give them one of your keys, and let's use this example of a 2 of 3. So you give them a crypto steal with one seed that is one of your 3 keys, and then you have another one that say you keep in a safe deposit box, and then another one that you keep, say, at home or work in some secure location. If something happens to you, there's a very clear process where the bank would give the safe deposit box access to your family, and your family has the seed that they already have. So they have a seed and one's in the safe deposit box. Well, that gives them 2 of 3. But if a rogue bank employee tries to peek in your safe deposit box, if your family member isn't good about securing it, well, each of those is only one key. Someone has to get both of them. So multisig is really, really good about this. You could do that's one way. You could do something like an Unchained Capital. Maybe they would hold one of your keys. And so if something happened to you, there's a very clear process up front where they would have instructions that your estate would get your Bitcoin and that they would work with whoever was your beneficiary. But again, they only have one of your 3 keys. That has a trade-off that in their current setup, they would be able to see all your balances and transaction history, and there's KYC. So, that may or may not be for you. And most bank safe deposit boxes would have KYC. But if you're worried about estate planning, you probably want KYC because you want to know that when someone presents themselves as your beneficiary, that they are the right person and that there's a clear process for that. And that it's important to separate the distinction between UTXO privacy and like driver's license, social security number privacy. Ideally, I want perfect privacy in everything, but I think the two are very different. Banks always require driver's licenses and social securities and things like that. And then there's a separate thing that is seeing your transaction history.
Okay, so now as I think about what you just said, let's leave out the third party for now. So I guess you'd have 3 locations where you'd be keeping kind of like a secure backup. and then you'd also have 2 or 3 hardware wallets with you to be able to make transactions, or how would you?
So one of the really big points about storing Bitcoin securely is that you don't want to have everything on you. I want that if somebody holds a gun to my head, I will tell them anything they want. But the first thing that comes with that is, if you want Bitcoin, we have to go to a secure location like a safe deposit box. And that's really important. It also means that if I want access to my Bitcoin, I have to go to the secure location. And that's a good trade-off to have. The alternative is just walking around with your life savings in your head. So you want to have these multiple locations. And once you have that set up, you can just configure sort of like what your security parameter is. Like, do you want to require 2 out of 3 of these locations, or 2 out of 4, or 3 out of 5, or 4 out of 5?
Let's say 2 out of 3 for our discussion.
Two out of 3 is the easiest one. And then you get some redundancy there. And because you have redundancy, you might not have to do the level of backups. This is another thing where multisig is really cool. So let's say you were just like a more casual type, and you said, okay, I have 3 seeds. I'm going to leave one with my family. I'm going to leave one with myself that I put in a very secure location. Think like, buried under a mountain or in a safe at my home, or a spot that only I know. And then a third one I'm going to keep in a bank safe deposit box. What are the odds that 2 of those locations are compromised? It's possible, but it's pretty low. And so you can get this amazing thing where the Bitcoin network doesn't care which 2 of the 3 signatures you broadcast. You just need any 2. So if your house has a fire, or the bank has a flood, or your family, I don't know, there's a crazy earthquake and they fall into the house falls into the middle of the earth. In any one of those cases, as long as 2 of those events didn't happen simultaneously, you're okay. And so you should have plenty of time to go to your other 2 locations, recover the keys, and then set up a new 2 of 3. Whereas in the previous single key world, everyone creates these backups and they litter backups all over the place. And now you have your most sensitive information littered in multiple locations. And then maybe they encrypt those with passphrases because they don't want anyone to be able to find them. But then they have to back up the passphrases. And this gets really, really hard. Multisig is just strictly superior in this sense.
And so, say in your safe or safe deposit box, would you maybe have a hardware wallet and the key on a crypto steal or whatever? The
so
seed phrase?
For me, I would recommend, this sort of gets back to whether you have a secure element and or a passphrase. So if you don't have a passphrase on your mnemonic and your device doesn't have a secure element, so like I'm talking about a Trezor 1, for example, where the passphrase input is done on the computer. If you want to have a passphrase on a Trezor, you should buy the Model T because then you can input it on the device directly. So that's a huge different security concern. Are you entering your passphrase onto a computer? Well, you're kind of doing it wrong. You should enter it on the device. So let's say you're using a Trezor 0 and you don't have a passphrase and you just have this mnemonic. At that point, I would probably just keep the crypto steal with that mnemonic written right next to the hardware wallet.
Gotcha.
You're not really getting any extra security by adding some sort of passphrase if you have to type it in on a laptop, and you really don't want to lock yourself out. And you would be surprised how many people lock themselves out of massive fortunes because it's not a password that you enter every day. It's not like logging into your Gmail or your work email, say, that makes you log in constantly. And it should be a very long, randomly generated password. Some password like password 1 is not going to cut it. So the password you make is probably 20 or 30 or 40 characters of gibberish. You're just not going to remember that 3 years later.
Yeah, no, and again, if you're, I guess if you die, your heirs aren't going to have your memory. So,
exactly.
So, okay. So I guess I get this. Basically three places where just to be really safe, you could just keep an unencrypted HD wallet and a crypto steal or something. Just there's no, it's gonna be really hard for both those things to perish unless it's like an explosion, I guess, or something. So
simultaneously,
right.
But you might think about some geographic diversity in that. I mean, I know people that have been in cities that had evacuations and they had large amounts of Bitcoin. And if you kept all of your keys in that city and then you had to evacuate, which is already very stressful, emergency type thing, you don't want to also be carrying your life savings. So it'd be pretty nice if you already had, multiple keys in other cities that were your backup keys. And then when you fled, you only had to flee with a minority of your keys. You never want to be carrying a quorum of keys on you at any time.
Wow. So now I see why you might go more like 3 of 5 or something.
Exactly. I think 2 out of 3 is a really easy place to start.
Yeah.
And it really does make sense for most people. But once you get used to it, you're like, well, if you're comfortable with 2 out of 3, you probably want 3 out of 5. But don't feel the need to start there. Start with 2 out of 3, and you get so much improvement. The one thing that you don't want to do that a lot of people make the mistake of is you don't want to do 2 of 2 or 3 of 3 or 4 of 4 because you lose your redundancy.
Sure.
Or 5 of 5 for that matter. So imagine you did 2 of 2 and just think of the worst case scenario. One of your hardware wallets was actually total malware that you weren't able to validate. You got basically a fake device. And this device told you that it had this extended public key, and you used that as part of your 2 of 2. So you had these 2 public keys that you combined to get to your Bitcoin address, and you sent all your funds there. And then it turned out that this hardware wallet will not give you the corresponding private key to sign a transaction. And your attacker says, bad news, your funds are now locked in a 2 of 2 where I control one of the keys. But I'm very generous, and I'll give you back half the Bitcoin. I'll split it with you. And they've been able to ransom your funds that way. That would be like one extreme example where, maybe you could make that kind of mistake. More likely, it's just a bug in one of the implementations, and you're just locked out forever. And these things aren't super likely. Like probably you'd be fine. But the whole benefit of multisig done correctly is that you can have one catastrophic failure and not lose any Bitcoin. And that's really the goal, is instead of saying like, how can I keep finding ways to be more perfect so that the odds of me messing up are smaller, which you should want to do, but is really, really hard. You're always going to try to do that. Say, how can I build a system where I can mess up once really, really, really badly and still lose nothing? That's a much better system. And so if you have that redundancy of a 2 of 3 or a 2 of 4 or a 3 of 5, something where there's flexibility there, then you can decide how much flexibility and redundancy you want.
The Bitcoin Game is sponsored by btckeychain.com, probably the most well-known Bitcoin keychains in the world. Get your own, just go to btckeychain.com. Technically, what is happening? You talked about an XPub, which I have to admit I'm just vaguely familiar with. I hear it referenced all the time. What is actually happening? What information is generated and shared when you're using hardware wallets to do multisig?
Yeah, maybe I should take a step back and explain how this works. So in Bitcoin, we have a private key, which is your secret thing that you guard. And then you have your address where you receive Bitcoin. And the address is really a representation of the public key. So there's this thing in cryptography or an asymmetric cryptography called a public-private key pair. And that private key and that public key are deterministically mapped. So that private key, the public key belongs to that private key. We can think of it as. And the public key is the part that you can give out. And the private key is the part that you keep very, very private. And then Bitcoin does some extra smart magic things where it encodes it in base 58. It adds this checksum. So if you're off by a digit, it will be instantly, you can instantly tell it's an invalid address. And it uses multiple hash functions, which is this like crazy next level defense against a quantum computer in the future. Bitcoin protocol is like very, very clever. But basically you have a public address, which is like your public key, and you have a private key, which is your secret. And that was how Bitcoin worked in the beginning. And it's still, everything that Bitcoin's ever done is always still compatible in the future because Bitcoin doesn't hard fork, and it always maintains backwards compatibility. So you can always use older stuff in the future. But one of the problems that we very quickly ran into with this is that if you're generating a new address for every transaction, then you're generating one of these new public-private key pairs. And this is going to be a real pain in the butt for your backups. Because if you generated like 100 addresses, and then you backed up that file, and you put it in a bunch of safe deposit boxes, and you encrypted it, and you put it on lots of USB drives in case they failed, and you had your whole thing, perfectly set up, and then you did 101 transactions, and let's say each transaction had a change address, on your 101th transaction, your computer would need to generate an address that wasn't in your backup. And so you'd have sent Bitcoin to an address that wasn't backed up.
And I remember Bitcoin QT did literally have 100 addresses, right, before it?
Exactly. And so this was called the key pool. And in practice, if the key pool was 100, it was always generating new addresses and pushing that out. So when you did a transaction and you used an address, it generated another one. But if you set your backups on day one, and then you didn't back up again, it's kind of wild that 100 transactions later, your backup would no longer be good. So developers came up with this very clever idea called there's what we created and then what we ultimately landed on is called an HD wallet, or a hierarchical deterministic wallet. And the idea is that you have one master private key that can generate many child public-private key pairs. And so that's something that you see in what's called Bitcoin Improvement Proposal, or BIP 32. But then there's another layer on top of that that's really cool that's called mnemonics, and that's what you see in BIP 39, where you have a bunch of words that map to the master private key, and then that master private key can derive all the child public and private key pairs. So that's a lot of word soup, but the idea is that you get this thing that is your 24 words, although that's also configurable, it could be less, but you get your 24 words that you can write down on a piece of paper, and those represent your Bitcoin. But what they actually are is a phrase that gets fed into an algorithm that outputs an extended private key, and then from there you can derive a nearly infinite number of Bitcoin addresses, enough for the rest of your lifetime. So you can back up once and never have to do it again.
So the mnemonic generates the XPub.
The mnemonic generates the extended private key, which is often called the XPriv, and then there's a deterministic mapping from the XPriv to the XPub.
So there's only one XPriv for any mnemonic.
Correct. And so this now gives you this thing where this one seed phrase can derive the private keys for billions of addresses. And it also has some other cool properties for like e-commerce and other things. But where this gets extra powerful is, let's say you create multiple of these, and then you combine multiple of your extended public keys into a multisig scheme. So you have, say, 3 crypto steals with 3 seed phrases on them, and those crypto steals each have a corresponding extended public key. Remember, the public key component doesn't have any security involved in it. It does leak a lot of private information, so you wouldn't want to go telling everyone what your XPubs are, but they couldn't steal your Bitcoin if they had your XPub. And then you combine the 3 XPubs from the 3 mnemonics, and you're able to come up with a scheme, say 2 of 3 in our example. And now you can generate an infinite number of addresses that are controlled by any 2 of those 3 crypto steals.
Okay, so the addresses can be created just from the XPubs. No, Gotcha. Okay.
And this gets to be a really cool thing, because we should think of the Bitcoin private key as just this really big secret, and it shouldn't really be tied to any specific piece of hardware. In practice, you load a mnemonic onto a hardware wallet, but you could see a world where perhaps one of those mnemonics was never loaded onto a hardware wallet. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that's included in this guide that I'm working on is if you're doing a 2 of 3 multisig, you don't strictly need to have 3 hardware wallets. You could have just 2, and then your third could be a mnemonic that you generated, say in a software wallet, which has some risks, and there's trade-offs that we talk about with that. But you could generate your third extended public key and mnemonic on this software wallet and put that on a crypto steal, and then throw away the mnemonic, the file, and just store the XPub and the crypto steal, and leave that in your safe deposit box, and that's your recovery option. So you use your 2 of 3 like you normally would, and if something happens to either of those 2 keys, you have this third one that you could go get. Or maybe you give it to your family and it's their recovery option. But then the idea is you're just using 2 on a day-to-day basis, but you have the third if you need it.
Okay. I mean, and theoretically, would you feel the same? You could just use one of your hardware wallets to generate what you need and then wipe it and create another, use your rather than the software, or
In theory, yes. In practice, it scares me because in this 2 of 3 scheme, we never want a quorum of devices to do anything. And so let's say there was a bug in, I'm not going to name a name of any hardware wallet manufacturer, but hardware manufacturer A has some sort of glaring vulnerability. And maybe it's not even their vulnerability. Maybe somebody is selling devices that look like hardware manufacturer A's devices, and you buy 2 of them, or you buy 1 of them and you use it twice. And it generates 2 of your keys in a 2 of 3 multisig. And it turns out that your attacker has those 2 keys because it had, say, a bad random number generator implementation. There was either a bug that a third party exploited or was an intentional vulnerability inserted into a fake device. If you do some scheme where you have to get everything right, then you haven't got the benefits of this multisig setup.
That makes sense.
But if instead you got 3 different devices from 3 different manufacturers, well, 2 of them would have to have been broken in a way that your attacker can exploit both of those things. And that's incredibly hard. So then you can be a little more casual about how you source them. Like if you're using a single key signature, you probably only want to buy devices direct from the manufacturer at in-person events where you say, I know you are the real cold card, or I know you are the real Trezor. Here is cash. Will you give me a device? And I would never recommend single key signature for anyone, but if you were going to do it, that would be an absolute must. If you have multisig, just go on their website and buy it. It'll be fine.
Okay. Yeah, it's funny. I bought a Bitbox once when Jonas Schnelli was giving a talk here in LA, but then to find out that I guess wasn't seen as a very secure wallet. Well, I guess it would still be okay in your scheme if it did multisig. But
yes, they currently don't support that. I know they want to in the future. And the beauty of this that I want to whip into all the hardware wallet manufacturers is that if you're a new hardware wallet manufacturer, you're someone we've never heard of before, you just launched a product tomorrow, no one knows who you are, and you support multisig, due to the additive nature or the additive security benefits of multisig, I would recommend including that hardware wallet tomorrow, even though it's this new fly-by-night company we've never heard of. Because again, it doesn't control a quorum of keys, assuming they get the basic things right. It's compatible with others. It's open source to the extent it can be. They make good choices in their implementation, but they don't have to be perfect. They just have to be decent, and they're immediately an additive benefit. So that I feel like there's an opportunity here for companies. I know of several that are trying to jump on this, but you could launch a product tomorrow. It could be mediocre, and you could be one of the top 3 products recognized on the market in 6 months, just by the nature that you support multisig and you're trying.
I mean, do you have a sense, because I see all these different random hardware wallets. One, I even tried to tag you when you said you were looking for new people, but are they all at least doing kind of the accepted practices with the standard derivation paths and all that kind of stuff, or are people kind of winging that still?
So I very quickly I put out a tweet saying, hey, if you make anything, I'll play with it if you want to send me one. And I almost had to backpedal on that because so many of them don't support multisig. It's like, what's the point? There's so many ways in which a hardware wallet could be compromised, and it's so impossible to prove that it's not, that there's just no situation in which I would ever recommend a single key signature setup. And so because of that, if your wallet doesn't support the best technology we have for making your storage more secure, which, by the way, doesn't cost more money. I mean, it does that you need multiple hardware wallets, but it's not like you need some fancy new special technology. If your hardware product doesn't do that, in my book, it's just not a security product. And so there's no point to consider it. And sadly, most hardware wallets don't support multisig. I mean, the only 2 that are actively trying are Trezor and Coldcard. The rest of them either don't do it or their implementation is so badly broken that there's no point in using it. And that's so frustrating because everyone should do this and it's not that hard.
So interestingly, Rodolfo Novak from Coldcard tends to discourage the use of multi-sig. And then I guess it would make sense that Ledger might, since they don't support it too. I heard both of them on Stephan's podcast, and I've also had Rodolfo on my podcast. But I know there's just worrying about we don't, I guess, have a real solid multi-sig tech that we will maybe be here forever. And I've had Pamela Morgan on the show, and she touted using Copay for multisig, but I think support for that multisig service was discontinued or something. So I guess there's just a lot of concerns about multisig. So I wanted to kind of throw those at you.
Yeah, I should talk about the things that were historically hard about multisig and some of the validity of the complaints and why it's better now. But it's still like very new right now. It's just getting to the point that it's good enough, and it's going to be so much better in the future. So there were a number of significant negatives in the past. One of them was that multisig transactions involve more signatures. Signatures take up a lot of room in terms of bytes in a transaction, and that increased transaction fees. And SegWit has this thing called a witness discount, which means that we count bytes differently if they're witness or signature data. And so this penalty for larger transactions goes away with SegWit, or it's much reduced. The main reason is that in pre-SegWit Bitcoin nodes, don't even see all the signature information in the witness script. So for them, it doesn't cost anything. Mm-hmm. And then it was kind of it's sort of a weird one. It was like an economic decision that, hey, this is like good for Bitcoin, so we shouldn't charge more for it. Okay. I think was like generally the thinking. It does lead to some potential weird stuff where, like, if you're creating an attack block that's harder to verify and you had a lot of signatures in it, that would like slow down another miner's ability to verify this attack block.
Have you seen people try to do that ever?
No.
Okay.
Like these attacks are like very theoretical. But there's also a thing that if you're booting a full node, you might not care about historical signatures, which is a big part of the initial block download difficulty, is like you want to verify that your Bitcoin is real when you receive it. So you want to be sure you're looking at the real Bitcoin network with the real consensus rules and the real proof of work. And so you should validate everything. But like, do you really need to validate the signature on a transaction that was 4 years ago? Like if that wasn't working, you would have heard about it in the Wall Street Journal, on Twitter, on Reddit. And maybe something happened in the last week or the last month that you might not be aware of. But definitely 4 years ago, everything worked. And so there's an argument that signature data should be discounted because you don't need to. It's not that everyone needs to validate that for all time. Whereas something that we do care more about is like how many UTXOs you create. We're really on a tangent of how the fine details of how SegWit operates. But if you're increasing the UTXO set, which is something that everyone needs to store for all time, that should be expensive. Whereas if you're performing a bunch of signatures, perhaps to reduce the UTXO set, maybe that shouldn't be penalized. So we changed the way we looked at counting the signature data versus the transaction data. Mm-hmm. And so because we have that change with SegWit, there's no longer this penalty. This penalty isn't so big against multisig. Mm-hmm. So that's like one, in the win bucket for multisig.
Gotcha.
That is a change. Another is that we have a format for how to share transaction data. So we have this thing called BIP 174, or partially signed Bitcoin transactions, PSBT, that has been merged into Bitcoin Core since I think V017. And what it does is it says this is like a standard way to serialize a transaction that is unsigned, that is partially signed, that is fully signed, and then we can broadcast it. And so if you're implementing a way for hardware wallets to talk to each other, perhaps because you want to do 2 of 3 across multiple different hardware wallets by multiple different manufacturers, we now have a standard. And so what's really cool is if you look at like Coldcard's current implementation with Bitcoin Core, you can connect your Coldcard to Bitcoin Core via an SD card without installing any software. There's no Coldcard daemon running. There's no like Coldcard software you need to install on your computer. It just straight out of the box, you can tell Bitcoin Core to generate you transactions and have your Coldcard sign them. Now, currently, that's only accessible via command line. So 99.99% of users can't do this. But you have to think that things that are built into Bitcoin Core always start via command line, and then they get adopted in the GUI.
So let me ask you, okay, it's via command line, which in and of itself doesn't make it really tricky. I mean, how tricky is it to follow along and copy and paste? And is it for people who are not technical?
I write code, so I think it's easy.
Yeah.
But if I watch my parents log into their Amazon account, I'd say some things are considerably harder for less technical users.
All right. So maybe hold off if you're not too technical.
Yeah, I wouldn't dive into that unless you know what you're doing.
All right.
Because again, there's real money on the line. Like if you want to play around on testnet, that's fantastic. It's a great idea to level up your skills and to see how well you can understand something. But I wouldn't go recommend somebody put their life savings on this unless they write code and really understand what they're doing. But because we have the standard format, I know that Trezor is working on doing the exact same thing. So they're adding PSBT support, and they have an SD card slot on their Model T, and they want to make that SD card do PSBT transactions with Bitcoin Core. And I don't know when they're going to release that feature, but when they do, you'll be able to have your cold card and your Trezor talk directly to your Bitcoin Core node with no other third-party software installed. And that's really cool.
Okay, so because of the BIP that has brought us partially signed Bitcoin transactions, we now really do have an established multi-sig kind of plan. So you don't have to worry about that.
And as soon as we have 2 wallets that support this, it's going to be like if you don't support this, you don't really support Bitcoin Core. I think it's going to be a thing where everyone has to adopt this standard. So it's moved really slowly up until this point, and we're about to hit this inflection point where it would seem pretty fair that once there's multiple wallets doing this, that any wallet that doesn't support BIP 174 just doesn't support Bitcoin. It would be like a wallet that didn't send SegWit transactions or couldn't generate SegWit addresses. We'd say like, it seems like it's not really updated, it's not maintained, it doesn't work with Bitcoin. I think BIP 174 will be like that in the future.
Okay. And I did listen to the episode with Andrew Chow about what he's doing to get Bitcoin Core there. But I don't remember. Do you have any sense like how long we are till there's a GUI for this kind of stuff on Core?
It could be a while. I wouldn't even put a timeline on it. But what's so neat is that it doesn't need, once we have all these parts that can talk to each other, you can build on these building blocks in different ways. So somebody could build a wrapper around Bitcoin Core that interacts with hardware wallets via HWI, that moves Bitcoin transactions around in partially signed states via BIP 174 PSBT, and puts a GUI on top of it. And I know 2 teams that are working on that exact product. Not to mention that's very similar to like what Casa and Unchained do. So I don't know like which implementation is going to win, who's going to be the first to launch. But the idea is these all become modular components. And once that happens, the speed of development just gets so much faster, because I don't care necessarily how you connect to your Bitcoin Core node. It doesn't matter to me whether you do that and you run an Electrum server and then you connect your Electrum client to it. If you do a command line through HWI, if you have some UI that's built on top of HWI, if you choose to use a third-party service like an Unchained or a Casa, which do have some trade-offs, but if you choose to use something like that and give up your privacy information and your consensus rules information, you can still accomplish the same thing. And we're just going to see more and more options now that we have a standard.
And just kind of a little bit off topic, but curious, say with Electrum, I've always thought it would be nice to basically host your own Bitcoin Explorer. Are there any tools that come with Electrum to let you, look at an address and things like you do on an Explorer that would not be so secure because you're giving up information?
Yeah, it depends how you're doing your Electrum server. There are some different like Docker files where they will spin up your Bitcoin Core and index all your addresses and then give you your own block explorer. And historically, when I played around with them, I've been kind of frustrated. But I hear that the last 6 months, they've gotten a lot better. And I want to play with what's out there before I would comment on it. So I don't have a strong opinion there. It is annoying that you go use a block explorer and you just gave out, hey, here's my IP address and here's the Bitcoin addresses that I care about. Now, maybe you do it behind Tor, but if you search for multiple addresses, then maybe you've given away which addresses go together. Privacy in Bitcoin is still very hard. But I would stress that as much as I want privacy for everyone, I want security first and foremost. If you have privacy but no security, well, that's not a good situation. If you have security but no privacy, there's still room for improvement, but at least you have your coins.
Gotcha.
So I want privacy for everyone, but I want security even more.
All right. Well, to me, I'm trying to remember if I once heard that one of the plug and play like Raspberry Pi or whatever solutions, if they had some kind of an Explorer that was built in. But I mean, that seems like a product a lot of people would really value, and I'm kind of surprised there's not an easy product like that available.
Yeah, part of the reason it goes back to this modularity thing, and Bitcoin Core has taken a deliberate choice to not have an address index in Bitcoin Core. So you can index all the transactions on your local node very easily and look up transaction hashes, but I can't say show me all the transactions for this address. I can say I want to create a watch-only address for a watch-only wallet for my Bitcoin addresses and manually upload some Bitcoin addresses that I want to watch. And so that is a nice feature that makes hardware wallet interaction much, much better with Bitcoin Core, but I can't just blanket index all the addresses. And that's a choice Bitcoin Core has made to make resource requirements lower, and also less code is more security. Okay. So the idea is like the more things you have Bitcoin Core doing, the bigger risk you have of some bug. And Bitcoin Core has chosen to do that. Some people think that's a great decision because you have less complexity, and Bitcoin Core is really, really good about resource requirements and usage. So that's a very good thing. The negative is it would be great if with your Bitcoin Core, you just got a block explorer and you could see what was going on. And the reality is that's much, much harder. But it is getting better. And I'm not an expert on that, although I want to, it's been on my to-do list to play around with that and see what tools are available now.
And am I correct that you could not do a watch-only address if you have a pruned node? Or would it still?
So pruning has to do with what data you store from the past. So if you had a new Bitcoin Core node and you said, here are the addresses that I care to watch, and then it synced through the whole blockchain and pruned, that would be okay. The problem is if you have a pruned node and then you say, oh, and I'd like to watch this address. Well, it needs to go back through the whole blockchain and see all the transactions in the past with this address. Well, if it pruned everything and threw away all that data, then it has to sort of restart, which could be a very slow process depending on what kind of hardware you had.
Sure, yeah.
And this sometimes sounds like it's like a bad thing about Bitcoin, but remember that this is everybody's node has to validate every transaction for all time. And that's a core part of the security guarantee, that we all know that the network rules are being followed and that we're all on the same network. So it's kind of an essential trade-off. If we just said like, hey, we'll trust some other people to validate everything, it would be a lot easier to run a node. But the whole point is that we don't trust anyone else.
You talk a lot about the benefits of testnet, and I think most people have never played with testnet Bitcoin. And the only time I've ever touched it was when Lightning Labs had a wallet that you could mess around with on testnet. And it was like the first time I've ever, I asked someone, I think, or I can't remember how I got the testnet coins. But how do you really get involved in you getting testnet Bitcoins and using them? Like, it doesn't even seem obvious to me in most wallets that there's testnet support.
Different wallets have different levels of support for testnet, but if you're doing multisig via Electrum, then Electrum supports testnet, and both Trezor and Coldcard support testnet. Unfortunately, Ledger doesn't, which is just wild. I don't really understand that decision. I heard they used to support testnet and they discontinued it. Maybe they're bringing it back because they support a lot of coins, but they do not support Bitcoin's testnet. But any reputable wallet will support testnet. And it's a great way to just practice everything. Like practice writing down your seed, maybe try what happens if you enter in different passphrases. Then you can Google for a free Bitcoin testnet faucet and receive free testnet Bitcoins. Practice deleting that hardware wallet and recovering it. Practice sending it to somebody else. Go back and forth a bunch. All of this is totally free. And it's almost identical to real Bitcoin, except we just all agree that it doesn't have any value. And periodically testnet gets wiped and we start over. Also, the mining difficulty is much, much lower on testnet because there's no profit incentive. And testnet is kind of like a screwy playground. But the beautiful thing about it is it's a great place to make mistakes because it doesn't cost anything. So just test everything. And instead of doing like one transaction on Bitcoin mainnet and being totally paranoid the whole time, just do 10 on testnet and be totally reckless and careless. And you'll learn so much about what happens if I do it this way or that way. And if you lose all of your testnet Bitcoin because you didn't write down your recovery phrase, that is totally fine. Those things don't cost anything anyway. So testnet is this like amazing resource. And I really recommend people just first go to testnet anytime they're playing with some new wallet software and just see what happens. You can't make a mistake. It doesn't matter. And you'll learn so much.
I've never noticed like on a Trezor a place to play with testnet coins, but I'll have to take a look.
Yeah, it's sort of like this hidden gem that's super valuable. If you're a developer, there's this thing called reg test that's more complicated, that's even freer than free testnet. Because with testnet, you need to get somebody to give you the coins. And there's a bunch of these services called faucets that will just give them to you for free, but they're very unreliable because people just have these testnet coins and give them out for free as like a goodwill thing. And there's a thing that developers use called reg test where they can do automated testing at scale. And so that's another tool that's available to developers, but it's far too difficult to use for normal users, and it doesn't really solve their problems. Just regular testnet network is great.
Gotcha. And I wanted to throw out, I'm not sure how much of this is accurate to be worried about, based on different things, different interviews in my past and stuff. So I know that obviously if you were reusing an address and there wasn't enough entropy, I guess, when you're creating or signing the transaction, that it leaks information and people could figure out your private key. That I think you even mentioned something about that.
So there's two issues when it comes to random number generation in Bitcoin. One is when you're creating your private keys, which then generate your corresponding public addresses. And then the other issue is the randomness or the K value used in your signature. And there are two different things that you can solve in two different ways. So when it comes to the generating your private keys, that's a step you want to be like really, really careful about. Because that would be such a good way for someone to steal your Bitcoins. And so think of this attack, for example. Imagine that you don't trust anything and you decide to implement your own wallet on your own computer, writing with your own software because you're a very clever person. And this computer is never connected to the internet. You remove the networking card, you remove the wireless capability, and it's totally air-gapped machine. And it needs some source of randomness in order to generate these private keys. So you use the random number generator that's built into the computer. But imagine now that that random number generator were tampered with by, say, the NSA. And it did not spit out a truly random output, which is an almost impossible thing to verify. You would generate on your air-gapped, completely quarantined machine a random input that would map to your private keys. But it turns out anyone else who had that same hardware could generate that same random input and map it to private keys. So even though you were never connected to the internet, somebody else could generate that same thing. And that's fairly terrifying. So this is one where like Cold Card, for example, allows you to roll dice. And it's like 99 dice rolls to generate an extended private key. But you only ever do this once. Then you have enough keys to spend and send and receive Bitcoin for the rest of your life. So you do this one setup thing, and really you should do it twice on two different devices to confirm you get the same output, and then you're good.
Okay, and since we're on that, I guess you must feel a little nervous about creating a private key any other way that besides rolling dice or other. Well, do you trust the way it's generated on hardware wallets or what have you?
So rolling dice is good because it's repeatable and provable. So you could have two different devices, roll dice, and confirm that you get, and put the same dice rolls into both of them and confirm that you got the same mnemonic. And so you'd say like, hey, I know this thing's being honest. It's not cheating me. Because it would be very easy for your software to lie to you and say like, hey, bang on the keyboard and we'll put in an extra entropy, and then just not use that. You wouldn't know. So if you've implemented your own thing, you can do exactly that, this bang on the keyboard. So I wrote a command line wallet for BlockCypher in 2015 that has a step where you mash on the keyboard. And you just mash on the keyboard for as long as you want. And it says, we're going to add this entropy to your random number generator that your computer has. and we'll combine the two. So it's only additive entropy. And if you trust that the software is doing what it says it's doing, well, then that would solve the problem of a compromised random number generator. But if you're worried that your hardware wallet was intercepted and it's not even a real Trezor or cold card, it's a fake one from an imposter, well, then banging on the keyboard for extra entropy, or in this case, mashing on the buttons, isn't going to accomplish anything because it probably just ignores it. So dice rolling is a provable way to say, hey, these dice rolls map to this mnemonic, and I can repeat that offline on other devices to confirm it. Whereas if you just use software that accepts extra entropy, which is a good practice, and a hardware wallet that isn't doing dice rolls should allow that, you can't prove that it's done that. But that hardware wallet is still protecting itself from the manufacturer. Like maybe the manufacturer slips in a bad random number generator, and then even though they weren't intending to, they got upstream supply chain attacked, and then you became a victim of that. So you want something that at the best security is to do the dice roll. The second best security is a device that prompts you to bang on the keyboard a bunch. And those are your two good options. And so that protects you from key generation, which is a great place for someone to steal your funds. The other place that you have to be worried about is this thing called a chosen nonce attack. And the way a chosen nonce attack works is every signature in Bitcoin involves some cryptographic nonce, or number used only once. It's almost like a cryptographic garbage. And if that number is known to your attacker, then they can steal your private key. And so we actually saw this in, I think it was 2012 or 2013 with secure random in Android library. And it wasn't securely fetching random data, despite how its name would sound. It was an operating system function that was available to developers. In other words, they were using the right tool, and they were calling this function secure random, and they weren't getting random bytes. And because of that, attackers were able to reverse engineer private keys on Bitcoin main chain and steal lots of Bitcoin. So the solution to that came out around that time, which is called deterministic K values. And you use as your K value the hash of the private key. So this is just an implementation decision that the wallets use. And so if they're doing this correctly, which again, it's hard to verify that your hardware wallet is doing what it says it's doing, then it doesn't matter if your random number generator is tampered with for that step either. But these are the types of things that, like, how would you possibly know this? I mean, that's something I jump to anytime I see signature code, is like, where is the K value coming from? Because I'm very curious about that. But even when I do it on I'm helping a friend do a transaction, I'm like, look, I'm only like 99.99% sure this is correct. I can't be 100% sure, and I know what it does. So that's a good example of multisig just being fantastic, because if one of these wallets had one of these vulnerabilities in it, the other one isn't likely to have that same vulnerability in an exploitable way.
Gotcha. So there's no need for a really good random number generation when you're creating a transaction anymore. Is that basically what you're saying?
If the software is doing it right, it shouldn't matter.
Okay.
When you're doing a transaction. And then on address generation, if you're rolling dice, then you're not using the random number generator. But most people aren't going to roll dice. They're going to rely on the random number generator, so you want that to be done correctly. And then I have heard of one team that's working on a hardware wallet that can prove that it's using a correct implementation of a nonce in your signature, which would be really cool. If these guys launch, I would totally recommend people add it to their multisig. And one of the neat parts about it is if you can prove that you're using a truly random K value in your signature, then you don't have to worry about this chosen nonce attack. And if this is one of your signatures in your M of N, then even if the rest of your hardware wallets were compromised, that still wouldn't be sufficient to steal funds. So this is an example of, like, as soon as more people have more hardware wallets that are out there that we can throw into the mix, it's going to be great to get different benefits from different ones.
Gotcha. Now, so determining the private key, you're limited to that one key. It's not like you can look at other private keys, part of the same kind of chain of hierarchical deterministic addresses. Well,
this is where it gets messy. There's a quirk of these HD wallets that is very much by design and has some benefits. It's a little bit of a longer story to go into, but if you have the extended public key and any child private key, then you can derive all the child private keys that are on that branch, which is terrifying. Now, there's two big buts in this. Nobody should have your extended public key, and no child private key, no private key of any kind should ever leave your hardware wallet. So neither of these two things should happen. But in practice, some of the hardware wallets do share the extended public key by default with their software, which I think is really bad, and why we want hardware wallets to default to using things like Bitcoin Core or Electrum, or relying on other third-party implementations instead of writing their own custom software that does things their own way. But none of them should have, nobody should have your extended public key, and no private key should ever leave your hardware wallet. That's just an absolute no-no. So I'm not too concerned about this, even though in theory it could be really bad.
Interesting. Okay. I feel like if you really think about it, you could wonder about things, but all right.
And again, the solution is always multi-hardware wallet, multi-sig. Just these are all the things we're talking about are these like 0.1, 0.01% chance of happening type situations, and make it so that somebody has to do that to two different hardware wallets by two different manufacturers. And you've just made the problem so challenging to your adversary.
Gotcha. Near the beginning of our podcast, you talked about the Tails OS, and I've heard of it. I've wanted to use it, but I've never taken the leap. How difficult is it to set up Tails?
Tails is actually pretty easy, and it's super compatible with like an old laptop you have laying around that you would say this thing's a junker and doesn't, can barely surf the web. That's your laptop to try Tails on. Tails is free. It's an open source. It's called the Amnesiotic Incognito Live System. Amnesiotic meaning like it wipes itself on shutdown, doesn't remember anything. And it's really neat because it comes with like a bunch of things that you would want to come with a computer. So it comes with a password manager that's very good called KeePass. It comes with Tor, the browser. It comes with Electrum and not much else. It's pretty basic. A text editor, some games for kids. But the neat thing about it is the best way to run it is to burn a DVD of it. And then you put that into the DVD drive of your laptop. And when it boots up Tails, and it gives you no access to the hard drive. So you have this machine that's like completely clean and contained. And if you really wanted to be paranoid, you could remove the networking card. You could glue up the Ethernet port. You could remove the Bluetooth card. And you would have this thing that was totally quarantined. And so that can be really good for like one of your keys. So one of the things that I didn't talk about is that or I may have talked about this a little before, but in a 2 of 3 multisig, you're only actively using 2 keys. The third key is not used. Now, maybe your access pattern is that like it's the 3 business partners and any 2 of you can sign. And so you actually, there's no like one key that isn't used. Sometimes A and B sign, and sometimes B and C, and sometimes A and C. But you could also have a scenario where you control keys A and B, and C is like with your family and is in their safe deposit box and is never used. So you have A and B. And in that situation, you don't really need your family to have a hardware wallet for key C, because they're only ever going to use it if you get hit by a bus. So, and at that point, they could just buy any hardware wallet and load that mnemonic in. So one of the cool things you could do is you could use something like Tails, and you could boot that machine up. And again, remember, no hard drive, no networking access. It's totally offline. And you could use that in software to create a third mnemonic. And then you could extract only from that machine the mnemonic, maybe write it down on a piece of paper or a crypto steel. You could save it to a USB drive if you prefer, and extract that and the extended public key, and then combine that with your other 2 hardware wallets. And then shut that machine down, wipe it, burn it if that's your paranoia level. But the beauty of Tails is that you don't have to. It just wipes itself. And now you have 3 seeds, but you only have 2 hardware wallets. And you could generate that third one for free using just software. So that's a pretty neat thing, and Tails makes that pretty easy to do because it wipes itself on shutdown.
Wow, so that's a lot. And I'll definitely, try to put links to everything you discussed. I don't know. Are there any other topics that you want to cover?
I don't know. I don't have any like product I'm selling, so I don't have any real message I'm trying to drive home. Just that multisig is great. So that's really the one takeaway I want people to have.
What do you think the short-term and long-term future is for, I guess, Bitcoin security for the less technical-minded?
Oh, I think this is just going to keep getting better and better. I think we're so close to having like lots of options available and more UIs on top of it, that it's going to make it simpler. And I think it really speaks to one of Bitcoin's core value propositions. So when we talk about money, we tend to use these like very traditional terms: scarcity, portability, durability, divisibility, fungibility, and recognizability. And that's like how we've evaluated all monies, because they've all had the same criteria. They've been physical things that we are hard to make, so they're scarce, and we look at them to verify that they're real. And maybe we have some more advanced tests than that. But they've all had these properties. And Bitcoin is the first time that we have something that you can have like some sort of a threshold scheme, like a 2 of 3. And that's really, really amazing, because that can make it much, much harder to steal, much easier to back up. So as much as all this stuff like sounds really complicated, think of this situation. You're like fleeing Venezuela with your life savings, and you have your family members, the 5 of you are all making a trip to whatever country you're trying to end up in, or maybe it's not even clear, you're just trying to get out, and you're going separately. And each of the 5 of you takes in their brain a mnemonic, and any 2 of them, say, or 3 of them, you pick your threshold, are enough to recover your family's Bitcoin. And they can stop, 2 of you or 3 of you, whatever your threshold is, and try to, stop you from leaving the country. But if whatever number you set as the number of you that need to make it out of the country do, you can start over with your life savings. That's like a power that gold just doesn't have. Nothing in human history has ever been able to do that before. That's really cool.
So do you have some 24-word seeds in your brain?
I think these things are actually very, very hard to memorize. I could do it if I was trying to flee. I do have a password that is long that I remember, but humans are not good at this.
Maybe just set to the right tune and we could do it.
Or think of this simpler one. Instead of something they remember, say they just write down on a piece of paper the 24 words. You could even in select circumstance use fewer words. So, maybe they only have 12 words and it's written down on a piece of paper, but as long as multiple border guards don't steal that piece of paper and figure out that the person who came last week across a different checkpoint also had a piece of paper that goes with this piece of paper, which, they're never going to figure that out. As long as 2 or 3 or whatever your threshold is of people make it through, you're able to cross that border with your life savings. And that is so unbelievably powerful and transformative for society. And that's not been possible before. A gold, they'll see it on you. The Romanovs died with their jewels sewn into their underwear because that was the way they got across the border. The Venezuelans are discovering there's metal detectors at the border. You can't just leave with a bar of gold. So this is a really cool thing that has never been possible before.
Do you already know the URL you'll be posting this guide on?
I don't, but I'm sure I'll be tweeting it out. My Twitter is at @mflaxman, like my name, Michael Flaxman. And I'll be sure to tweet it out there once it's ready, and hopefully it'll be very easy to Google.
Aside from your Twitter, is there anything else, ways to contact you or your website you want to mention or anything like that?
My website is like my name. It's michaelflaxman.com, or my Twitter, mflaxman, and everything's on those 2 places usually.
I'll tell you, I could probably do a couple more hours. I've got a million questions, but I want to keep this reasonable. So it was really great to be able to pick your brain and learn some stuff. So thanks so much for coming on the show.
I hope it's helpful. I know Bitcoin can be kind of overwhelming, but it's also just so amazing that we have this technology and it's something people can learn about and use in their lives how they see fit. So I encourage everyone to learn more.
I really get a lot out of hearing Michael talk. I hope you do too. Be sure to visit this episode's show notes page at thebitcoingame.com, where I've compiled a ton of links related to the topics we discussed. If you like this episode, I bet you'll like my exclusive interviews with Peter Kroll, the inventor of the paper wallet, and also with white hat hacker Johoe, who recovered Bitcoin during the 2013 Android RNG problems. Just look for episode 56 and episode 7 at thebitcoingame.com. See you next time.